So it's about time to switch over to Q&A, but before we do that, I have to ask one question to attempt to trigger Zachary.
Oh, goodness.
So it seems fairly obvious how God can know what creatures will do on Calvinism, right? You can see it. Look, he's already triggered. I haven't even got the question out yet.
Disputation 52.
So it's easy to see how God knows what free creatures, quote unquote, free creatures will do on Calvinism because he determines what they will do. On Molinism, however, and remember this claim that's being made, it's actually very, very broad and very powerful. The claim is that God knows not only what every free creature will actually choose, and remember they're choosing in a libertarian sense, he will also know what any free creature would do in any circumstances that creature was placed in. Even if God never creates that creature, any logically possible creature, God knows what that creature would do in any possible set of circumstances. How on earth would God know that?
Well, it's not on earth. For who are you, O man? To speak back to God, who is he that darkens the counsel of him who created you? Okay, so yes, let me find the relevant thing here. Okay, so the way that this works is in the philosophical literature, it's called the grounding objection. And anytime you see something that's called grounding objection, you should immediately be suspicious because of two reasons. First, there are grounding objections to all kinds of things. One of the most popular ones besides this one is the grounding objection to time, which is to say, how can we talk about future statements as being true if they haven't happened yet? What thing is there that grounds them? And so that's why some people accept the B theory of time, because they say, well, all things are real, so that's what grounds them. But the reason you should be suspicious is because grounding objections presuppose so many metaphysically complicated ideas that are way above my pay grade to even begin to analyze, that in order to understand the question itself, you have to do a whole lot of research. It's one of those questions like, who created God? In order to answer that, where do you even start? You have to go all the way back to basic modality to figure out what necessity and contingency is before you can finally worm your way back to that question. So that's the first level, but you're like, oh yeah, you're just dodging, aren't you? And I am. But Molina's answer to this, it's a little unsatisfying, but I think that it has it kind of has the potential to be developed into a full metaphysical theory. And what Molina said was, if you can follow the thinking here, in God's natural knowledge, that contains all of the possible things that he can do, and that's knowledge of himself and knowledge of all possibilities. So what if God thinks to himself, let's be really blasphemous and anthropocentric, and let's say that God thinks to himself, can I create a creature with libertarian free will? And God thinks in his mind, he comes up with a conception of some given creature. And then he comes up with the conception of a creature with free will. From there, Molina says that he has a concept of an individual in his mind. And it's still in his natural knowledge. He just knows that this is something that's possible. And Molina says that in order for God to be truly omniscient, he has to know every possible thing about that conception. So let's suppose that God then asks himself, well, what would this creature do if I put him in this circumstance? Molina says that if you say that God is ignorant of what follows, that's impious to the highest degree. It's actually a really good quote. He gets really it's his most Luther-esque quote, where he says, that you Thomists, you Calvinists, you Determinists it is impious to the highest degree to assert God is ignorant of what I would do by my free will. That's kind of his response. But the idea is that if God truly can know that he can make a free creature, and if his omniscience completely super comprehends any possible conception of anything, then you kind of have to say that it follows in virtue of God being maximally omniscient that he has to know what that creature would do. And the ultimate grounding for what these creatures are doing or would do is it's going to be, first of all, it's truly grounded in his omniscience. You ask, what makes it true that God knows this? It's that he's omniscient. and then you have to say, where does he get it? It's within his conception. So it's almost like saying that God understands math because he can conceive of all possible mathematical theorems and things like that. And there's an interesting paper from about 2 years ago, and I can't pronounce the author's name, unfortunately, because they're both German. But the paper was on Leibniz's complete concept, and it's called Complete Concept Molinism, where they take this really weird metaphysical concept that Leibniz had of a complete concept, and then say, this is the kind of thing that God has in mind when he thinks of a free creature. And then they define a new philosophical term called a choice function, which a choice function is something that follows from necessity of a creature having free will. Now, most people may be saying, yeah, but where in the world is any of that in the Bible? And the answer is it isn't, because you're asking a